Hi, I'm Molly. Welcome to the Festival for Change. Let's get. So I'm here. I'm Molly. I'm a student at the University of Manchester, and I'm here today with Michael Jacobs, who is an expert in post-neoliberal policy and political economy, specialising in climate change. Michael's going to be talking for 5 minutes about COP26 and what's happened. And you've just got back, is that right?
Yes, indeed. Got back yesterday from Glasgow.
Fantastic. Okay, so over to you.
Thank you very much, Molly, and thank you for having me. Thank you to everybody who's joined this morning. So yes, got back yesterday from Glasgow, been reflecting on what happened. I'm sure you'll have seen stuff on the news and listened and looked at various internet comments. Let me try and sum up what I think were the main highlights and unfortunately some lowlights. So let's take some of the main issues. So mitigation, that is cutting emissions, was in many ways the kind of biggest single thing that at least the media and the public were led to expect that was going to happen at Glasgow. We were told this was the last chance to save the planet. On that, Glasgow was never going to be either the last chance to save the planet, because we've always got to keep going, but also it wasn't going to be the big moment at which countries said that they were going to do more to cut emissions. They came to Glasgow with their decisions on what they were going to do already made. And that's the Paris Agreement form. We have these things that you may have heard of called nationally determined contributions, and the clue is in the name. These things are nationally determined, and so every country came with their policy commitments. But unfortunately, when they were all added up together, they do not put us the world on a path to 1.5 degrees, which was the Paris aspirational goal. In fact, we now know that they're likely to put the world on a path to 2.4 degrees of warming, which is incredibly dangerous, catastrophic warming. So the COP did pretty much the only thing that the COP could do, which is to acknowledge that these are not good enough, that what countries are currently committed to doing over the next decade to 2030 are not strong enough, and to say we will come back next year with stronger commitments, these so-called nationally determined contributions. That was pretty much as the COP could do, and it did do it, and that is quite a big deal. Countries came to Glasgow really not wanting to improve the ambition that they had agreed at home, but they have agreed now to do that. You'll have heard, no doubt, that India and China objected at the end to the language in what we thought was the final text to phase out the use of unabated coal. That's coal without carbon capture and storage technology. And that language was changed at the very last moment to phase down. That's disappointing, but to be perfectly honest, it isn't a big deal. There was no timetable on the phasing out. And so phasing down and phasing out in the next decade, which is when coal and other fossil fuels need to be reduced, probably makes no difference. And in many ways, I think it was an own goal by India and China, because they just drew attention to that issue, and they're going to be under more pressure to phase down over the next 10 years. On finance, which was the other big issue at the COP, developing countries got one thing that they wanted. They wanted more money to go towards adaptation, that is coping with the climate change they're already experiencing. And they got the developed countries to commit to a doubling of the funds that go towards adaptation. So they will have been pleased at that. In fact, it says at least doubling. But they didn't get a commitment to the 500 billion over 5 years that they wanted from the developed countries. As you may be aware, the developed countries promised as long ago as Copenhagen COP in 2009 to provide 100 billion a year by 2020. They didn't reach that sum in 2020. They're now not saying they're going to reach it till 2023. Understandably, the developing countries said, well, why don't you make up the shortfall in 2024 and 2025 so that we'll get 500 billion over 5 years? That was not agreed. The figure stuck at 100 billion per year, and there'll be a new process for working out how much developed countries should be mobilizing after 2025 to follow. The other big issue which caused a lot of anger amongst the developing countries was on loss and damage. That's effectively the compensation that countries suffering from climate change, if you like, want from the countries that have caused climate change. This is, after all, an issue that has been almost entirely, not entirely, but almost entirely caused by 200 years of fossil fuel burning by rich countries, that's us, and other developed countries. And the most vulnerable countries want compensation for that, what they call loss and damage. For loss and damage, they didn't get it. All that was agreed was that there would be a dialogue about this, and they have vowed to come back next time. So those were the main issues, I think, which we can focus on. There were some others, but let's leave it at that and let's take some questions.
Brilliant. Okay, so I have a first question, which is just from me, and that is kind of what were your thoughts around agriculture not being included in negotiations?
So the interesting thing about the climate negotiations is that they have tended not to mention specific areas or sectors of the economy at all before. They are about, on the mitigation side, what countries should be doing by way of reducing emissions. And the metric has always been the tons of greenhouse gases that are predicted to come from various policies. And it hasn't been about the sectors which actually cause them. So as various people have noted, this was the first time that any COP decision, and we've been doing this since 1992, has ever mentioned coal or fossil fuels. And the reason for that was that these were the sectors that needed to be acted on, but the COP, the UN process, only ever discusses the outcome in terms of emissions. So we did get coal mentioned, we kind of got fossil fuel, or at least fossil fuel subsidies mentioned, but other sectors which cause greenhouse gas emissions, including agriculture, but also including industry and transport, these didn't get mentioned at all. So I don't think it's particularly significant that they haven't been mentioned. There were, of course, various side agreements which people will have heard about, particularly in the first week of the COP, which were orchestrated by the UK as host to get various countries, coalitions of the willing rather than every country, plus often companies, to commit to reducing their emissions more than they had done before. Some of those on deforestation, methane, energy, transport were quite significant. There were some smaller initiatives in that part of the conference on agriculture, but they are as yet pretty minor. And this is one huge area that really not enough work has been done on. And actually over the next year, when countries have to come back with stronger emissions reduction commitments, I think this is one area that we could all, I think, focus on more.
Brilliant, thank you. So we now have another question from Henry Lusengore, which is it really likely that countries will improve their NDCs by next year?
So this is a great question, Henry. And there are really two kinds of answer to this. There is a legal answer and there is a political answer. The legal answer is that countries have been instructed by the COP to come back with stronger commitments next year, but it's counted by lawyers as soft law, this. It isn't the hard law of an international treaty. But even in the international treaty, if countries don't abide by it, there's almost no sanction against that. So countries they haven't been legally obliged to come back, but they have been told by a body, the UNFCCC, which they all respect. And the reason that China and India were so anxious about the language about phasing out and phasing down is that they take this language seriously. They could easily have said, like Australia did, well, we don't really care about this language because we're not going to do it anyway. But they didn't. India and China and the developing countries, who all in their diplomatic kind of approach, all really value the rules-based system, which the UNFCCC is part of, do take that language seriously. So yes, I think that they will come back. But whether they come back with much stronger commitments depends, I think, on the politics. And that is, frankly, about all of us in every country around the world, or at least in all the big emitting countries, applying pressure on governments to come back not just with any strengthened NDCs, but ones that are in line with the 1.5 degree limit of warming that we're now all aiming for. So I think the political answer is that depends, and it depends on the politics in each country, as well as the international pressure.
Brilliant. Okay, thank you. So the next question we have is from Sayed Mohammed, and that is, what is your view on coal phase out or phase down?
Well, as I said in my introductory remarks, I don't think this is as big a deal as it has been made out. It was obviously very dramatic that India and China, and it was India that took the rap for it. China, rather sneakily, didn't really explain that it was also objecting to the phase out language, and India was the one who was required to say it in the plenary session. A lot's been made of that. It was very dramatic. My understanding is that Alok Sharma told them, I'm not going to put this amendment in the text. If you want to amend the text at this last minute, you're going to have to say so in the plenary yourself, and you'll see what the reaction of all the other countries are, which was pretty brave of him to face down India and China in that way. But that will be the final language. I don't think it makes a lot of difference, because if all of this happens in the 2040s or even in the 2030s, it's too late. And of course, phasing down and phasing out in this decade, in effect, mean the same thing. I don't think there'll be any difference in the behavior of India and China in response to phasing down as there would be to phasing out. If it's all done late, and after all, India earlier on in the conference, Narendra Modi, the Prime Minister, came to Glasgow and said that they were going to go net zero by 2070. So India has actually already committed to phasing out. But on that kind of timetable for coal, that wouldn't do. We will be well over 1.5 degrees by that time. So I don't think this is massively important, the change in language. In a way, as I said, I think China and India have just invited more pressure because of their behavior at the end of the conference.
Brilliant, thank you. And I know you spoke a little bit earlier about how kind of looking at individual sectors is maybe not that productive, but I was wondering if you had any thoughts on kind of the presence of like players in the fossil fuel industry at COP26, and whether that kind of, you know, was something that needs to be looked at a little bit more in depth.
Yes, I mean, there was a lovely little report done by the NGO Global Witness in the middle of the conference, which they very enterprisingly counted. They went through the delegate list, which had been published by the UN, and they counted 503, I think it was, people have come from the oil or the fossil fuel sector. And they pointed out very cleverly that this was larger than any individual delegation from any country. This got some headlines, which was great. Of course, they weren't all lobbyists. Quite a lot of those people who'd come from the oil and gas sector were people setting up exhibition stands and organising the events and so on. And to be perfectly honest, there's been a little bit of misleading, I mean, perfectly reasonable, but misleading commentary about this, as if the oil and gas sector people were in the hall actually influencing the text. And of course, they weren't. The only people in the negotiations are parties to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change, which is 196 countries plus the EU, which has a seat at the table of its own. Nobody from business, from NGOs or others are in the rooms negotiating the text. You can observe from the back of the hall, although it was difficult this time round because there were restrictions on numbers because of COVID. But nobody is involved in negotiating text except countries. Now, of course, there are very strong business interests which lobby governments. There are rich countries where their oil and gas sectors, often nationalized, are very important in those in what governments say. So I definitely think that the process is influenced by those companies, particularly actually by the nationalized ones in places like Mexico and Saudi Arabia. And of course, the wider debate is influenced by the business lobbies as well, not just the oil and gas sector, but all the business lobbies for renewables and for electric vehicles and various other things. There's a lot of that going on, but not in the negotiations around it. But then there are also a lot of NGOs. There was a fantastic presence of NGOs, particularly from the global south this time round. You know, there were people from the Amazon, First Nation peoples and indigenous peoples from the Amazon and from other parts of the world at the conference, speaking, making their voices heard. There were fantastic demonstrations in the middle weekend, including the Fridays for the Future demonstration at which Greta Thunberg spoke. So there were lots of voices at the conference around the negotiations.
Brilliant. Okay. And so the next question we have is from Nicolette Bota, and this is: does the increased money for adaptation come with priorities or priority locations for spending it?
This is a really good question, Nicolette. It's up to each country, and then it's up to the international institutions, which also disperse some of it. So the World Bank, the regional development banks in different parts of the world. By and large, money that goes to adaptation is determined by the countries that receive it. So most aid of that kind is provided to governments and sometimes to NGOs who themselves decide what to spend it on. So you would hope that that would go on the priorities that the people would really want. That's going to be more or less true depending on the kind of government it is. But the adaptation money in general, I think we can say it does go towards the most important projects and and initiatives which will help people cope with the climate change they're already experiencing. So there's quite a lot, for example, of flood defences work being done, of sea defences against rising sea levels and storm surges. There's disaster relief, which counts as adaptation in countries that experience extreme weather events. There's quite a lot of work going on in agriculture to try and enable farmers to cope with the variability of seasons and rainfall that they're seeing, and so on. So I'm, without obviously knowing in great detail what's happening everywhere, one couldn't be that, I am pretty confident that that money is quite well spent. There's much more anxiety about the money that goes towards mitigation, because a lot of that is loans, that is to cutting emissions. A lot of that is loans, and a lot of it is private sector. And obviously the private sector is only interested in the things that it can make money from. Those include renewable energy and other things. But I think there's often a feeling that much of that goes towards the richer countries, which are more secure for investors, and often goes to providing electricity for urban populations that are not as badly off as rural populations, where it's a bit harder and where obviously people are poorer. So on the mitigation side, I think there are some more questions about where some of the money goes.
Brilliant, thank you. So one thing that I'm quite curious about is whether there's kind of a view that we're relying on technology that doesn't exist yet, or exists in a way that's not in its most efficient form. And there's the whole kind of idea about, that we can't consume our way out of this crisis. What would your thoughts be on kind of, technology involved?
So for the next 10 years, and the next decade is the absolutely decisive decade. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the body of all the climate scientists around the world, says that to be on a path to limiting global heating to 1.5 degrees towards the end of the century, we need to cut global emissions by 45% on 2010 levels by 2030. And if we don't do that, 1.5 degrees will not be kept alive, in the language of Alok Sharma, the COP president. So it really matters what happens in the next 9 years, the next decade or so, and we have all the technologies we need to deal with that over the next decade. There is no need to wait for technologies that have not been invented yet for the next decade. We know how to produce electricity from solar, from wind, and so on. We know how to make homes more efficient. We know how to do things like taking carbon out of steel production, which has happened. We know how to power vehicles from electricity. So the technologies are available for that. In the far distant future, you are absolutely right that the models show that we can only keep temperature rises to around 1.5 degrees if we take carbon out of the atmosphere. And that's why the target is net zero and not simply zero. We're going to have to take carbon out of the atmosphere. Now, there are 3 ways you can do that. One is by more vegetation. Trees and other plants and so on take carbon out of the atmosphere. So the more that we can do to grow plants, obviously protecting biodiversity at the same time, the better. Another way is by capturing carbon before it goes into the atmosphere, so carbon capture and storage, and then storing it underground, or possibly storing it in useful products. So, for example, you can use carbon dioxide to make concrete. That's a rather clever technique. And the third one is the really experimental techniques, where we don't yet have the technologies at scale, which is sucking carbon out of the atmosphere. So a lot of people are now working on this. There's a lot of suspicion often in the green movement about new technologies of this kind, but frankly, we're going to have to do it. We are beyond the point where we can say, let's just not pump carbon into the atmosphere in the first place. That is obviously the top priority, and that's what we must focus on, but we're going to have to take it out of the atmosphere. And so if you look at the models later on in this century, we will need those kind of techniques, but that is later on. I'm sure those techniques will have been developed by then. There are limits to the amount that you can plant trees and other kinds of vegetation, particularly for that purpose, since we also need land for feeding people, and we've still got a growing population. So there are some really tricky issues here, but we should not be misled into believing that we've got to wait for some new technologies for the decisive decade, which is the next one.
Great, thank you. So our next question is from Beatrice Barada, and that is, what is your view on loss and damage outcomes from the COP26?
So thanks, Beatrice. As I explained, loss and damage is the idea, essentially, that developing countries should be compensated for the damage, the costs that they are experiencing as a result of the 200 years of fossil fuel use that the rich, developed world has put into the atmosphere. And this is a kind of key principle. Climate change is an issue of justice. Climate justice is now the term that we heard a lot at COP26, because it's been caused by rich countries and its worst effects are being experienced by poor ones who themselves have contributed very little to the problem. And so the idea of compensating developing countries for the damage and the loss that they've experienced has become a very important principle. And it's one that the developed countries really hate. And the reason they hate it is not that they won't admit rhetorically, as some of them did here at COP26, that they are responsible, but that they fear that this is going to turn into legal cases where the amount of money that they are needed to provide will be determined by a judge in an international court and not simply by what they think they can afford, which is how climate finance is done now. And if you can imagine, we've already seen some fossil fuel companies being taken to court by countries and climate campaigners, and some countries also being taken to court. Developed countries are really anxious that that is what would happen if they acknowledge the problem of loss and damage. Now, the developing countries came to Glasgow with, I thought, a very reasonable proposal, which is almost to say, let's settle this out of court. If we settle it out of court, you don't have to formally admit your liability, but you have to pay us some money. And that's a kind of typical thing that happens in things like libel cases or various other legal cases that you'd find in any country, where somebody complains, takes the case to a court, and the other side says, well, we don't accept that we were liable for this, but we're going to pay you lots of money anyway. And that was essentially the proposal that the developing countries came with. Set up a fund and put some money in and start repaying us for this, and we will not take you to court. But the developing countries said no. They are still very worried about this, and they said, well, we're prepared to have a dialogue. And frankly, a dialogue is not good enough for the vulnerable countries. So they have said, we're going to come back next year with the same demand. We haven't seen the end of this one at all yet.
Brilliant. So kind of sort of bouncing off that, do you think that the kind of finance systems and the legal systems that we have surrounding the climate crisis at the moment, do you think they're effective? Like, how would you change them if you could?
They're not effective. Not enough money has flowed. The monies that have been decided to flow were not enough in the first place. And they're particularly not enough now. The 100 billion a year was first agreed in Copenhagen in 2009. And of course, 100 billion is not worth now what it was then. So that sum of money has effectively declined with inflation. And of course, the needs have gone up. We've had 12 years since then of continually rising emissions. The climate has got hotter since then. So that sum of money is no longer adequate. Well, it wasn't adequate, to be perfectly honest, in 2009, but it was at least agreed. And what we need to see is effectively trillions of dollars flowing into developing countries to help them reduce their emissions and to cope with climate change. And obviously, most of that was going to come from the private sector. The governments don't have trillions to spend towards this. And there is lots of money which potentially in capital markets could go, but it's not very well regulated. As I said, it tends to go to the countries that are already richer. It tends not to go to the poorest people because they can't pay so much to give the returns to those financial institutions and so on. So the system doesn't work very well. Much of the money that is given by governments is in loans, not in grants. And of course, a loan is not really a gift. A loan, you get your money back with a little bit of interest, even though it's generally very low. And of course, many of these developing countries are now incredibly indebted. They've gone through a terrible pandemic, which they're not out of. They're not properly vaccinated yet because we've been hoarding vaccines in the north. And giving them loans, which just piles on further debt, is really not a very sensible idea. So the system doesn't work very well. There was one really interesting thing that happened at COP, which hasn't really been reported, which is on the possible use of SDRs, of so-called special drawing rights issued by the International Monetary Fund, the IMF. So on that first day, you may remember seeing extracts from a speech by the Barbadian Prime Minister, Mia Mottley. And she called for SDRs, special drawing rights. It's a kind of global, it's a kind of form of reserve currency that the International Monetary Fund can issue, and has issued this year. She wants more of those to be spent specifically on climate compatible development in developing countries, and potentially on loss and damage, actually. And that proposal was made by her. There's quite a lot of activity at Glasgow around it. And I think this proposal will only become will come more to the fore as it's realized that there is more money that could yet flow to developing countries. And I think that's a really interesting idea.
Brilliant, thank you. So the next question we have is from Nicolette Bota again. And that is, how fast do countries need to racket up their NDCs to constrain warming to 1.5 centigrade?
Very fast is the answer. So currently, projections of emissions in 2030 are that they will rise, not fall, rise by about 13 to 16%. The IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, has said they need to be cut by 45%. Now, that is a huge, huge difference. So from a rise of 13 to 16 to a cut of 45% means that every country that produces any significant amount of emissions is going to have to change its policies very considerably. Now, that 13 to 16% doesn't include the commitments that that have been made coming into the COP. So they've already done something, but we're well off the path. The organization Climate Action Tracker, which was quoted quite often because it was the one that produced in this last week, the reckoning of what those emissions reductions that have been committed to, what they will add up to. They are the best organization. If you look at their website, Climate Action Tracker, they will show you, there, they've got a little temperature dial, and they've also got the graphs which show how big that emissions gap is. The emissions gap is the gap between where we need to be and where we are, and that is still a big gap. So this is a major effort that needs to happen. And it's not going to be easy. You know, we can talk glibly about reducing emissions by 45%, but that means policies that will impact on all of us. It's policies that will impact on jobs. If you're in the oil and gas sector or the coal sector, if you're a miner, or in Aberdeen in the North Sea in the UK, which is where our oil and gas is produced, that's jobs which probably won't exist in the future and indeed might be cut. So another bit of the language of the COP26 decision, which called for support for a just transition, meaning supporting the groups of workers and communities that will be adversely affected by action on climate change, was very important. We're going to have to do a lot to help those areas. The last time we tried to make an industrial transformation of this scale in the 1980s, when under the Margaret Thatcher government in the UK, effectively the coal mining industry was ended, more or less ended. It was incredibly painful. And the places in the UK that were dependent on coal, near my own university in Sheffield, in other parts of the North and the West and the Midlands and Wales and Scotland, they've never recovered. Those are still the places that are the most disadvantaged in the country. And we now know them in the UK as the Red Wall. They're places that have voted Labour for almost ever. And now, because they have not yet recovered from that 40-year process, some of them have got really fed up, and people have started to vote Conservative. Now, that's politics. That's the everyday politics that we face in the UK. And similar areas in the US are exactly the same. So why is Biden's infrastructure package, including a huge amount for climate change, been held up in the US Senate? There are two senators who are holding out. One of them is just a maverick from I think it's New Mexico or Arizona. But the other one comes from West Virginia. West Virginia is the heart of the American coal industry. And that senator is worried about the jobs for his constituents. So none of this is easy. It's very easy for us to say, we must do this, we must cut emissions. But this is painful, it's difficult politically. And what we have to do as people who care about climate change is put as much pressure on governments to make those commitments, but also to recognize that people need help in this transition. That's what we call and what we mean by a just transition.
Brilliant. Okay, so we only have time for, I think, one more question. Maybe we've got 2 more minutes. So this is another one from Henry Lewson Gore. And he's asking, what can developing countries do if they don't get their demands on loss and damage compensation?
So I think the interesting thing that's happened over the last 10 years or so in these climate negotiations and in kind of the development field is the recognition that climate compatible development, so that is growth and job creation and income raising in developing countries, which respects the climate, that is, it's reduced emissions, it's adapted to climate change, is actually good for people. It's not a cost. So if you look at India, for example, India has every reason to phase down or out coal now for reasons that are nothing to do with climate change, but air pollution. I was just chatting this morning with a colleague who is the former colleague of mine in the British government, who is the deputy ambassador to India, lives in New Delhi, the High Commissioner. And I asked her how she is, and she said she's suffering very, very badly from Delhi smog. Delhi is absolutely enveloped in smog from pollution, from vehicles, from coal burning, and India needs to do something about that, or the government will not be re-elected. And that's almost nothing to do with climate change, but of course it's related to it because it's the same molecules which cause air pollution and which cause carbon dioxide, some of them. China is the same. Many developing countries, their urban areas are highly polluted. We know that renewable energy is better for health. It's better for nature, and so on. We know that you can keep biodiversity while also producing food. So the idea that acting on climate change is just a sacrifice, is just a cost, is wrong. And that's what many developing countries have now found, and they are committed to climate compatible development because it's good. And it's good for reasons other than global climate change. They need money, they need help to do it. So the more money that developed countries, the private sector can provide, the better, but they're going to do it anyway.
Brilliant. Well, thank you so much for coming today and speaking. It's been really, really interesting. I'm afraid that's all we have time for today. But if anyone watching would like to hear more from Michael, there's a really good interview on the Mint magazine. And there's also an article called Closing the Glasgow Gap.
Well, there are several, actually. Can I do a little plug here?
Yes,
so
absolutely. Go for it.
I've written a series of articles for an Australian online magazine, free, not behind a paywall, called Inside Story. So if you Google Inside Story Australia, you'll find an article on their front page at the moment, which is my summing up of the Glasgow COP26 event. And if you Google a bit further there, you'll find some other articles I've written about COP, coming into it and during it. One on the demonstrations and on the relationship between climate action and capitalism, and so various other things. So have a look at that. Inside Story Australia, you should find them.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much. That's all for today.
Thank you. Enjoy it.